So welcome everyone. I'm Tim Henning. I'm your co-host with Ike tonight. And tonight we have an incredible speaker, Kevin Arnold. Kevin Arnold is the Director of Architecture and a Managing Partner at Expert Analytics. And he's also a Microsoft MVP. He's a super nice guy. He runs his own user group, the DFW user group. So when you get a chance, they have really great presentations and a ton of content there. So check them out. Tonight, Kevin is going to be covering building a data warehouse on the shores of Onelake in Microsoft Fabric. Kevin, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, let me get myself set up since as soon as I start sharing, everything goes away. Well, thanks for that introduction. I hope that I live up to the hype of being incredible, but you never know. So yeah, thanks for that nice introduction, Tim. And as I said, we're going to talk about data warehouse on Fabric today, right? So on the shores of Onelake, and we'll get in a little bit of what that is in here in just a second. So yeah, we'll go through this slide really quick. You know, it was the same introduction that Tim just had. But what you can also see here is Twitter. I guess I should update this slide to say X now, right? You can reach out to me there, reach out to me on LinkedIn, any place that's social media. I try to get the name of Kev Arnold. And another thing that we do is with Chris Wagner, Kratos BI, we do a live stream every Friday called Fabric Friday. We talk all about Fabric, which includes Power BI. So I put that YouTube link here in the slide. Hopefully you could go out there, subscribe to that, join us on Friday mornings. You'll hear if I had a wine dinner on a Thursday, which is unusual, but it happened the other day. So it was, I got through it, but it wasn't the easiest presentation that week. So one thing about my presentations is I love questions as I go. I love the dialogue. I love the conversation along with it. So questions in the chat, questions if you want to come off mute, that's a good time to ask me to slow down or to answer something. Please do so. So that's kind of my style. Sorry, I hoping I had just a little bit of something to eat to not be hungry beforehand because it's like 7 o'clock here. So hopefully that won't mess me up too much and won't cough too much on you. All right, so what we're going to do is go through and talk a little bit about, no, it wasn't wine at this time, Ahmed, unfortunately, or beer or whiskey yet. So that's afterwards. That's in celebration after this. Okay, so we're going to go through and have a little bit of an introduction into Fabric and Onelake, and then how you could make the choice to use the data warehouse. And we'll talk a little bit about the T-SQL coverage, and then we'll get a little bit into what we've covered a while ago on Fabric Friday, and I improved this a little bit of doing source control of your database objects and getting it published out there. And then last, working with the data, right? Because, you know, I think this is a pretty decent order. We got to talk about, you know, the architecture, the underlying architecture that we want to use, what components of that architecture, what's good and bad about it, how to get things in the Git. And then finally, if you're bringing all this data into something and you're not getting it back out, say through Power BI, you're not doing anything with it. Okay. So I'm going to ask before I move on to the next slide using the raise your hand feature. How many people here already know about Fabric and are, I'm going to qualify it. You know about Fabric and you're actually doing something with it. So I think I saw a max of 3 at any point, so I'm at 3 or 4. So that's, you know, that's pretty good. So good. That means for some of you, for a lot of you, this won't be kind of repeat. You're going to learn a little bit about Fabric. All right. And you too could put your own Fabric presentation together by using this aka.ms Fabric Notes. It's a nice little repository of predefined graphics for helping talk about Fabric. So, you know, kind of exposing all of my little secrets here of how I quickly put presentations together. But Microsoft Fabrics is and I love this little thought bubble up top. It's a unified software as a service, SaaS, platform for all of your analytics needs, right? So your analytics needs, it's not there for doing application databases, for doing other type of work. It is intended to be for analytics. And it's really spawned out of the need for Power BI, it is very important to transform your data into the star schema, model it correctly, right? And have all that going on prior to trying to produce your report. And with some data that's extremely large, complicated, those techniques, you could maybe do it in Power Query, but there's better techniques with some of the other data engineering options out there. And so Fabric introduces more data engineering options. We're going to focus a lot on what's on the bottom there of data warehouse and data integration. So that's mainly where we're going to look. And then data integration, I also kind of talk about Spark or notebooks and using a Lakehouse format at that point. But what's really makes Fabric unique is what's in the middle here, the Onelake part. So Onelake is unified. It's open format. And so what does that mean? That means everything is written into what's called Delta, and some people say Delta Parquet, but Delta tables. So let's move on a little bit to the next slide, right? Oh, well, across here, there's unified security, and then there's shortcuts to other cloud platforms. We're not going to touch on that tonight because we're going to focus in on our data warehouse area here. And it is powered by Delta Parquet, as I mentioned. If you're already used to using SQL, that's great because you could do a lot in SQL. If you happen to have to touch Spark, you could do some of the stuff against warehouses in Spark. All right, so let's look at it a little bit different way. Fabric itself is many workloads in one platform. That platform being Fabric, with the base of it being Onelake. So we could have a warehouse, a lake house, a what's called Custo database. You're seeing things come out called event streams and things like that go into Custo, or a data set, which is now called a semantic model. I should have grabbed an update of this slide. All could access that Delta Parquet format. So that's huge. That's I think one of the biggest things about Fabric going here. Now, what happens is when we're producing these Delta Parquets, we come through a compute layer. And so I'm going to turn back on my little pointer here. And for a warehousing, we come through this T-SQL layer and get it landed into a warehouse for write mode. For the SQL data engineering, which is going to be notebooks, we come through a Spark layer and land it into the Lakehouse. Same thing that happens over here for the Custo KQL. It comes through the Synapse real-time analytics, which are event hubs and everything. Come through the KQL engine and store it into a Custo database. If I had arrows, if I remembered how to do arrows, I would look at analysis services as doing more this way of reading. Let's see if I do, is it Alt? No, Alt just does. There's got to be some way to do arrows that I don't remember. So the nice thing about analysis services is since these are all Delta Parquet, it could really read any of these data stores here. And everything could be brought right into the Power BI semantic model now, which is huge, right? So you don't have to, once you do this, you don't have to kind of rehost it, or if you didn't want to, you don't have to import it into your semantic model anymore. it can read directly from the Delta Parquet files. So less time moving the data around, less time refreshing it. Things get a whole lot faster, a whole lot smoother there. Okay, so that's looking at it from our many workloads into one platform. The other thing is we have many roles that also work on one platform. And so I mentioned earlier already, a data engineer. Anybody, by show of hands, consider themselves a data engineer here? Mostly, I got Benjamin. Yeah, four people, right? So if you're doing some work in Power BI, you're doing some data engineering work. It's just whether you're doing it with the more with without Power Query with other platforms. But if you're doing Power BI work, you're technically doing some data engineering because you're bringing data in. Even if I'm bringing in an Excel source through Power Query, and then I transfer that to a nice star schema, you are now a data engineer. So hopefully with that a little bit different definition, everybody is thinking they're doing data engineering work. Fabric itself opens up more possibilities for doing this data engineering work. We have Data Factory here. We have Synapse Data Engineering, which is going to be your notebooks. Again, we'll focus more on the data warehouse, which is your T-SQL side, Synapse Real-Time Analytics. But also on this whole platform, if you were a data scientist, and I am not going to claim to be a data scientist, I keep trying to move into it a little bit more. But if you're doing machine learning, you can reuse all the same data that your data engineer used before, right? That they saved for you. You don't have to do your own data ingest and everything. You could just use the same data that was brought into the Onelake and do your machine learning models, whatever it is that the data scientists tend to do. Okay, since we only had 3 to 4 people, maybe it was 5, say that they're data engineers. How many of you think that you would classify yourselves as data analyst? Let's raise our hands around that. Oh, 2, 3, 4. Okay, about yeah, a little bit more. So I'll hit on something that you guys are here soon, I would think. I don't know. But data analyst, right? I would say that most data analysts that we tend to talk about most of the time start off here in Power BI, right? They're only going to be kind of working with Power BI, but now because we open up zoom in, arrow, control and shift. Okay, thanks. Okay, now I got to try it, right? Control and shift. Ooh, yeah, there's our nice arrow. Thanks. Okay, so a lot of people, as a data analyst, most do a lot of their work in Power BI. But if you know T-SQL, right, and you said, "Oh, I wanted to get over into doing SQL if I could get the people to give me database access," right? And that maybe would get really restricted. Fabric doesn't solve the problem on whether or not people are going to restrict you from it, but if you could get access to the same data that somebody else is already bringing in, you could do it all through T-SQL. T-SQL is huge around doing Fabric. And if you wanted to get into doing real-time analytics that we kind of talked about, the data analyst could do that as well. Okay, so I have to see a whole lot more hands when I ask this one. Do y'all consider yourself the data citizen? How many people would put themselves in there? And I see 2 people already have their hands up.
I actually don't know what that means.
That's a good question. So a data citizen, I would say, is the consumer, right? You're really not, maybe you're going to build a report, but you're not going to do any of the data modeling ahead of time, maybe just produce thin reports, a couple reports up on the service. You're going to consume reports that your analyst or your engineers put together for you. That's how I would define it. Whether or not that's how they've defined it here, but that's how I would use it here. Does that help, Amin? Would you agree, disagree?
If it means I'm a data person in how I go about the world, like I use data to make decisions, like that's
Yeah.
how.
Yeah, and I think it can mean whatever you want it to mean within your organization, right? But, a citizen data developer, right? They're trying to say people that aren't getting into any of the deeper type of code, maybe not even get into Power Query a whole lot. And so they're just going to focus on Power BI and what's called data activator that sits inside the Fabric
So citizen here
platform.
is probably short for citizen developer. That's what I missed. Is that
For
what you're thinking?
for business, I'm sorry, I missed that. Business.
Are you thinking that citizen is short for citizen developer really here?
Yeah, I think where I grabbed the slide from, I think it could have been named a little bit better, but data citizen, citizen developer, they're just kind of out trying to get a couple things done really quickly. They're not going to drop back into these roles, right? Because I would say your grown-up part would be from here. Ooh, it goes the other way. Shoot. This way, right? You start out as a citizen data developer or a data citizen as they have it here. You probably grow into being a data analyst. And from there, I would think most people would grow. Oops, that's the wrong box. I'll get this down. Would grow. See, I did it the wrong way again. Into that, right? Into the data engineer, and then probably last into the data science. Some people like the data and jump into data science a whole lot sooner than somebody like me or others, but I still got to think through the data science a whole lot more um, than a lot of people at this point. So that's why I tend to think you work from being somebody that just works with data day in, day out, simply, right? Consuming reports, maybe modify a couple of it. I know Power BI a little bit to grow up into doing the data analysis, right? And when you're doing data analysis, you might want to write more SQL, write some other type of things. So that's where the warehouse comes into play. Then you're going to kind of grow into, hey, I have this bigger data engineering need. And so I'm going to add the other tools into it. So that's kind of how I see a lot of this going. Okay, get my cursor back here. So we have all these options within Fabric. I have the seed of data science. Okay. So we have all these options within Fabric. And the two that I really want to focus on is, do you want to use a lakehouse or do you want to use a warehouse? And how do you make that decision, right? Oh, I think they just left their hand up, Tim, from earlier. You could probably put their hand down. Thanks. Um, so how do you make that decision to whether you're going to use a lake house or you're going to use a warehouse? And for me, I'm going to focus on one part and one part only. I think this right here is your biggest decision point, right? What does your team look like? What are the skill sets that your team has should drive your first decision in your architecture on whether you want to introduce a Fabric data warehouse or a Fabric lakehouse? Because it is going to be those different skill sets to use it. We're going to focus more on the skill sets of the warehouse today. But let's kind of run through it again from top to bottom, right? You could bring in the same amount of data volume, unlimited. On the warehouse, you're going to have structured data. So think about a relational database. That means you're going to have tables and columns that are already, formed out. To where a data lake, you could have a files area that you could store videos, you could store images, you could store JSON, whatever, it really doesn't matter, right? Where the JSON is going to be your semi-structured, but it's really still first consumed by text. And then it also has a structured area. Within Fabric, it's called the tables area, and it becomes those delta tables again. So, if you're just going to work with structured data, you're used to doing that. You have a lot of source systems that are kind of, say, relational database, SQL Server based. Start off with a warehouse, but know the skills that you have on your team. So Benjamin, you bring up a good point. You're surprised cost is not on this slide. And I'm glad you asked that because I didn't think about addressing that. So Fabric itself, because it is a SaaS-based process, there's no cost difference between running a lakehouse or running a warehouse. There might be what's called CUs, compute unit consumption, which could indirectly get to cost, right? So when we're thinking about cost of Fabric, it's capacity based. You're going to purchase a capacity. The cheapest one is an F2, and I actually have clients that I run on an F2. They're very small. Cost you $260 a month. It's going to cost you that $260 a month, whether you put one warehouse on it, one lake house on it, 5 warehouses, 10 lake houses, whatever. It's going to cost you that same amount. Now, as long as you're not exceeding the processing time of the CUs that an F2 complete or allows you to have, there's no cost difference. So that's why I don't think cost is really a factor anymore. The cost is as you grow, how big of a capacity you want to buy. And I would then say into it, there's always a way to reduce consumption by having better written code, but that's not going to be your first thought here, at least not from what I'm seeing at this point. And if you want to add on in the chat or come off mute and kind of add to your question, I'd welcome that. But it was a great question. Okay, so the skill sets, and again, this is where I kind of, and I'm going to probably make a note to cover that on this slide in the future. Again, talking about your team, a lot of people have come from warehouses that run on a SQL database, right? So SQL, a ton of people have SQL skills. I think there's a lot of people that have Spark or Spark SQL skills, right? But I don't think it's as many as just have run with SQL, or at least people from that progression that we just kind of talked about. So if you and your team has SQL skills, then start with a warehouse, right? And I would say probably a lot of solutions might start to where your primary skills are, and then you might want to venture off maybe in another workspace and a side project to work up the lake house or whatever. But again, trying to come to run through what your decision should be, people and skills that you could hire in, right? If you're looking at it from a manager standpoint, is it cheaper for me to hire in people that know SQL or cheaper to find somebody that knows Python, Spark, and everything else, right? So, yeah, and ChatGPT, so Benjamin, yeah, you could translate the T-SQL into Spark SQL in most cases. If you're gonna write notebooks, you're probably gonna first, if you're used to writing T-SQL, then you're probably going to first transform over to writing SQL within your Spark notebooks. But you got to get comfortable first with getting into that, and you still might have a couple PySpark things that you have to do. So it's an interesting point. I still don't know that it would be any cheaper, right? In your CU comparison. Benjamin, I see you got your hand up. Do you want to come off mute and kind of add to that?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So with that being said, can you talk about having code in version control? I mean, regardless, like that's one of the things with people, like, like we just keep on appending stored procedures on a server, and then suddenly 2 years later, you have well, what's actually going on here? So sometimes that little bit of friction of saying, well, we want to work in Spark, we want to work with Spark SQL, at least that kind of forces the notebook model, which forces version control. But more specifically to this conversation, how does version control play a part in this Lakehouse warehouse or the Fabric environment? Because
Yeah.
I'm really curious on your response on that.
Okay. Yeah, and that's definitely that was one of my demo items that I'm gonna come up on. But I'm gonna disagree with you on the notebook forces you to do version control. You could stand up a I think almost any platform and not connect it to source control and write a notebook that's not versioned, right? And you're right. I agree with you. I think the people doing SQL development don't work with version control as much as they should. And I know whenever I'm turning over projects, because I always start with version control, and I'm going to show you how I do it with SQL. Azure Data Studio. I'm going to talk about Visual Studio Code. And if you don't start to get into that, I think you're missing the boat on how to do your SQL development. Once I got developers used to it, I've kept a lot of problems from sneaking in by able to do code reviews of procedures that have changed and everything, and see those commits and have everything and make deployments and all that other automation stuff. So great. Yeah, Benjamin, that'll come up here in a little bit. Great questions. Thank you. Now let's kind of get down to the bottom part of this, right? So at the bottom, we're going to talk about reading as the first bullet. Now, what is interesting is regardless if you do a lakehouse or a warehouse, like we were talking about, everything comes down into Delta Parquet tables. So either engine can read from the other engine. So if you create a warehouse, you could read those tables or even those Parquet files, however you want to get to it, in a notebook. If you create a lakehouse and create tables, you could connect to those through T-SQL, right? And over here it is saying it has great T-SQL coverage. We're going to talk about that in just a second too. So, that's the beauty of it. And the solution that I kind of talk about for a small client that I put in, each source system that I bring in, which are all cloud-based source systems, I set up a new lakehouse and bring in that data exactly as it is, kind of my staging area. And then I have a warehouse, and just like any other kind of having multiple SQL databases on a SQL Server instance, I could use three-part naming to reference those other tables, including the ones inside the lakehouse. I don't have an example of that today, but that's a good example. That is a good method for sharing data between lakehouses and warehouses. And then on the reverse, with the lakehouse, you would have to find the Parquet file or the Delta endpoint, and then you could code that into your notebook in Python. One of the other big things that warehouse has that the lakehouse side does not have, and if you need this, it's multi-table transaction. So what that means is, and probably a lot of people don't use transactions, but if you need a transaction, you definitely know how to use them and use them quite a bit probably. But when we write SQL has an inherent transaction model to when the statement ends, the transaction commits. But you could change that by starting a transaction, and then you have to explicitly commit the transaction. And not only can you do that by starting a transaction on the data warehouse, and we do this in SQL a lot too, we may start a transaction, process 2 or 3 tables, and then actually commit it. And then that's when all the changes to those 2 or 3 tables are all recognized by others all at the same time. So the warehouse has a multi-table transaction model built into it, kind of like what SQL Server already has today, where the Lakehouse side doesn't have that today. I don't know that that's even on the roadmap or whatever, but This will always be, this is right now a definite benefit for warehouses. So shortcuts, remember shortcuts I showed on another slide? That's shortcutting, say, out to Google or to AWS or even other Fabric instances somewhere if you got permissions. So Lakehouses support shortcuts natively. They say here that warehouse, it's yes, access through the Lakehouse. So it's kind of a two-step thing, right? You'd have to stand up the Lakehouse, produce the shortcut, and then, as I was saying, you do the three-part select statement. Now you could get access to the T-SQL endpoint from that Lakehouse. So yes, it can do it. It's technically correct, which is always the best way, the best correctness. But it's a little bit once removed, right? And we've kind of touched on this, a whole bunch, right? Query across items. Yes, you could go across lake houses and across warehouse tables within your warehouse. And you could do that over on this side across Lakehouse, warehouse tables, across lake houses. So I'm trying to think if there's actually a way to do it across workspaces. I've only done the Lakehouse and warehouses within a workspace. Warehouses, I know you could get access to all the other underlying files in other workspaces. And I think that's what this is trying to call out, is across Lakehouses that exist in other workspaces. Okay. Lots of fun. The T-SQL coverage, that's, they say it's really good. And I think it is really, really good, right? It has great SQL coverage, but there are some things that you really have to be aware of. There are some data types that are not supported. So a lot of systems we see written in SQL today use the nvarchar or nchar, and that's not supported. You cannot say create table with that data type. You have to use the varchar data type. Money is an old data type that seems to be still in a lot of systems that I come across. So here I'm trying not only say what I found is not supported, what you could do instead. Oh, I meant to update this slide. I'm sorry. I meant to change those two titles. Anyways, everything is kind of what's not supported or another way of doing things. Identity columns. Identity columns are not supported. Oh, I skipped date time. Date time 2 or date time is another SQL type. It's for whatever reason, their precision is down to 6 rather than 7. And a lot of systems were coded using date time 2 with the precision of 7. So that's a pretty simple one to get around. Identity columns, that doesn't look spelled correctly either. Identity columns are not supported within, yeah, it deserves another T. I agree. It's not supported inside the data warehouse. And what you have to do is set in code. So I end up using a lot of techniques inside my data warehouses where when I'm building the SQL statement to either typically to insert new rows and detecting the rows I need to add, I will do a query into a variable to say, what's the max identity number I have today? And then do a row number and add that to the row number so that I could then build out the next one in loop, and it builds it all within the one table. I think for a lot of people coming across from SQL Server and writing stored procedures, this next one is really kind of a big blocker for everybody. Temp tables are not supported, right? Nor are temp variables, right? So the hashtag table name, those are temp tables, and you could do a declare at some variable name and call it a table and give it a structure. Neither one of those are supported. What I do is I set up a certain schema called STG for stage. And if I'm going to write something that I need to use across multiple procedures, say I want to just have one procedure produce that so I'm reusing my code properly, I will then put that into a stage table and use that as my temp table, right? And because we just have this one lake, it's not a big deal to do that. So I could use a create table as select, or I could select into one of those stage tables and go ahead and have it created on the fly for me, just like what I would have done with temp tables. Don't know that if temp tables are on the map, how far off that they want to go. I know, like they said, they already have great SQL coverage. They want to get more and more. But some of this gets into play on the architecture that's behind it. The SQL engine here is closer to what we used to have in Azure Synapse Analytics, or also known as Parallel Data Warehouse. And because they're trying to make it a massively parallel process, there's some things that it just won't be able to do, or they're going to have to find other ways around it. So anyways, that's my way around it right now, and it's been working. So maybe others will find a different way. Primary and foreign keys. So they are supported, but they're not enforced within the Fabric Data Warehouse. And I'm going to show you in the database project that I have. I actually messed around with this for about an hour or so just before this presentation. And I finally figured out a good way within my source, my database project that's in source control, to go ahead and script out having the primary key and foreign keys produced, but not enforced. I like having still the primary key and foreign key, even though they're not going to be validated, for documentation. And you could actually have that out there and then look at writing maybe a generic routine that's going to say, tell me the metadata that's out there using the information schema, and then do that to right away to verify your own foreign keys. Because I still think that's important afterwards. It's just not going to happen while you're building out the data like we have in some of the SQL Server databases today. Some people are very big on using the merge SQL statement. Hopefully, if you're doing that, you already understand that there's a lot of idiosyncrasies with merge, and sometimes it doesn't work the same way that you would think it would. I tend to avoid merge anyways because I was bid on a project pretty badly about it. So I usually write out my stored procedures, looking at the data I need to process. If it doesn't have a way for me to tell, well, hopefully it has a way. I'll be able to tell, here's what I need to do updates on, and here's what I need to do inserts on. And I'll write those as separate things rather than write a merge. Some people like doing merges quite a bit. And recursive queries are not supported right now. That doesn't mean that CTEs are not supported. You can still use CTE, which stands for Common Table Expression, but you can't make that CTE be a recursive CTE like we see in a lot of systems today. All right, so how did I know some of this? Well, let me see if I could find, here we go. Because I didn't put everything on here. But if you come out, there's this article, and I'll put the link in the chat here. And that T was for Texas, Tim. It got stolen. So, but here's some other things that are not supported. And so if you come out to that link, Fabric Data Warehouse, T-SQL Surface Area, this is what they're going to keep updated. This one causes me a little bit of problems as well. And Benjamin, you were kind of asking about having source control without the ability to alter, drop, add columns. Source control is a little bit of a challenge right now. So you might have to do some special processing if you're going to add a table to a column, to where you might have to script it out where you save the table or rename it first and then create the new one, move the data over. It's a little bit of a pain. I'm hoping that's going to get fixed. I should probably add that to the other slide. And then truncate isn't supported. I know truncate is used a lot of times. So I just do it if I'm going to actually rebuild a small dimension or something like that. It's not worth my while to always make it say, do the work for figuring out what's inserted, update it. I'll do a delete from the table and then just reload it. So, always come in and read the documentation. And it's going to kind of talk to you about what's going on. Another thing that you could see is, I don't remember, I don't think I have, I had to be careful. Index limitations. There is no concept of indexes over in Fabric. So that's an interesting thought on it, right? Is we don't produce indexes at all because all of the data is going to be stored in Parquet. Parquet is your columnar kind of stored database or a file, and then it has a Delta transaction log on top of it. Those type of files, we've been getting around with very big data without any indexes at all. So, and it actually makes smaller files behind the scenes, multiple Parquet files for how it's all stored. So, yeah, you don't have to sit there and think about, and that you're kind of right, Tim. It's interesting. They don't even say, like, I've never tried it, but I think you would get an error if you say create an index on a table because we're not using indexes today and it runs fast enough. So not only limitations, not even there. It's a good call out. Let me stop sharing for just a second to see if I could find this other article I had saved. I thought it was in the same tab, and it's not in the same browser as that other one. Yeah, I must have closed it. I apologize. But what I was trying to get to is when you read the Fabric or you read the T-SQL. So let's look at merge. Let's just search for T-SQL. I think I got cap locks on. And if we find the Learn documentation on that, you're going to see up here it has a applies to, and it tells you what it works for. And notice Microsoft Fabric is not mentioned here. So, and we've already saw it over on the other exclusion page, right? So that's to be expected here. If we go to insert, you can see here that it is calling out that it's supported in Microsoft Fabric. So if you're really wondering what some of the differences are, right? Look for this when you're inside the documentation to know what is used. Some things might have a little bit different syntax or something. Let's see. Oh no, this is just telling you the navigation. I hit one the other day to where the syntax or some of the limitations were a little bit different. So it had a little separate article for it. So that's how you want to go ahead and try to figure out what to do with your SQL stuff. All right, a lot of talk, a little more action, huh? So let's get, oh, I lost you guys. Here we go. Okay. So let's get into some demos, right? We'll go ahead and create a data warehouse. I've already created a couple for this. And this is where I'm going to get into my VS Code, and we'll talk a lot about that, Benjamin. That's what kind of covers your questions at that time. We'll show a little bit about ingesting data and reporting on data. All right, so let's give it a try. Find the right screen here. So I have here a Power BI, well, a Fabric workspace that I just called FFDB project because I just reused one that I had for our Fabric Friday the other day. And I'm gonna build out a database based upon the Contoso database. You can see by the name here, I already built one out earlier just in case things fail. But I'm going to use this SD demo database that I already created. But if you wanted to create a whole new, oh, my personas changed. I like changing my personas, right? If you change your persona to data warehouse, you could just click on warehouse and it's going to ask you for a name. And it's going to just start creating that. It's extremely fast. You'll see it's going to have this little warning for a little bit, But as soon as it stands up everything in the back end, that's going to go away within, it's gone within a couple seconds there. So now this is available to me, ready to use. It's that fast, right? Imagine, you got to get with your IT department and say, hey, I need a new SQL server or a new database on this, boom, like that, you could stand it up. So that part to me is kind of amazing. There is also, if we come back out to our overall, if you want to get started, I strongly recommend to people to set up your own development environment. That's what I'm running off of here. It's free from Microsoft. You get 25 licenses that you can mess around with things. And because Fabric is still in preview, you see we're back up to 59 days of a Fabric trial. You can start the trial, mess with it. They have sample warehouse data, all kinds of learned stuff. That's what you really need to kind of go through. Okay, so we have this empty database. I'm going to use the empty one of this SD demo. And we can see it's empty because I'm just going to come out here, look through DBO, right? There's nothing here. I created this, nothing up my sleeve. So as I was saying, I'd like using database projects. Well, let's introduce database projects a little bit. Find the right window. Come on, stay there. Okay. Inside Visual Studio Code, you could do this in Visual Studio Community Edition. There's a actually the other day we were talking, that doesn't work there yet. So use Visual Studio Code, or you could use Azure Data Studio, and you're going to add an extension onto it that is MS SQL. And when you add MS SQL with Visual Studio Code, it automatically adds the database project scenario. Okay, so let's look at my database project. What I did is I reversed engineered this from a Contoso database that I had out there. And you could see it's created a bunch of folders that match the schema names that I have out there. So I have a schema called data, data2, which is some views that I was messing with. And then the primary views are underneath the DBO. If you're familiar with the Contoso dataset, and you want a big version to work with, right? The SQL BI guys released out a way to generate a database, and I went out and grabbed one with 10 million rows. But this is how they put it together. All of their data goes into a data schema, and here's all our tables underneath here. So all of these files are as all my create table statements. If I had stored procedures like we were asking about earlier, they would be in my database project, right? My views are in my database project. So I could have multiple people work on this, put it into a Git repository, which this one is, and I'll actually give you guys the link. So if you wanted to mess with it or clone it, go through the normal Git type of processing so that I could do merges, have multiple people work on it, make sure I have one source of truth, move it through the process to get to production, all of that type of stuff. And you can even automate this into like an Azure DevOps to do your release, because this has a way to do a build and a publish to it. But just to kind of walk through it a little bit more, right? I'm going to pick up customer, right? Each table is its own file object here. You notice we're going to have it as the statement as create. Even if the database had the table out there, this project, when I do a publish, is going to compare what's in the project to what's in the database, write the proper alter scripts or anything else that needs to be done. I mentioned earlier that foreign keys and primary key, foreign keys have to be, they're not enforced, and you have to write them a certain way. So I just discovered this a little bit earlier today. I added what's called a post-deployment script to my project, and I'm telling it here that I want you to read these 3 other files that I have outside of my project. But what I'm doing in those 3 files is having the correct syntax to alter the table to add the constraint and give it a constraint name this is a primary key. It has to be non-clustered within Fabric, where default on most SQL databases, we're going to make it clustered, and we have to tell it to not enforce it, right? So these database projects will partially write this out, but it wasn't doing a great job for me. So I moved it over to my own. And then as well as the foreign keys, this has foreign keys on the orders table. Say it's going to from orders over to our customer key. And again, they're not enforced. So they're really just there for documentation. And it's going to help us potentially build semantic data models, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll come back to our data project. And I'll show you how easy this is. Once I kind of did all the changes, right? Because this database had things like that nchar, money, stuff like that. So I got rid of all those. And now this builds out for my target platform. I have my target platform set to Microsoft Fabric here. So I'm going to do a publish. And I'm going to tell it publish to an existing SQL Server, browse for a profile. I like this one. I don't know why I don't just move it to the right place. And I have a connection string that is just to my overall Fabric Friday workspace. And so that's what that's doing here. And it's asking me, which database do I want to go ahead and do that to? Oh, it actually picked up new name already. Sometimes it didn't pick up the new one for me. That's why I produced the one called SD demo. And I'm going to tell it, so I want it to go into that database, and I'm going to tell it to generate the script. Let's get rid of this while it's doing that. You see it's going to process. It actually builds the project down here. So if I had any errors during build time, it's going to tell me that I have errors, and it's going to stop the process. And it's going to give me error messages up here so I could go through and fix any of my code, which is really helpful if you have multiple developers, you're doing merges and things like that to try to find that somebody broke something. Okay, so it should be here just any second now. And this gets run as what's called a SQL command script. It's a little bit different than just a normal SQL script. So the first thing I'm going to do is connect it back to my database. And I have to tell it the server that I'm connecting to, and then also the database name itself. So now I'm connected down here to SD demo. And because I need it to run as a SQL command, I need to turn this on, right? So you can see what this is doing is it has done behind the scenes a compare to what's in my project to what's up in my actual database. And it wrote out all of the SQL that it needs, all of the DDL statements in the correct order to add these. And it's, you know, a big long script, but now I'm going to go ahead and tell it to run. And you can see it ran, and it's going to tell us it finished. If we had an error, it's going to tell us the error over here. But if we come back over here, see how that just refreshed? All of my tables are here now, right? So managing your database project is a good way. Those are the views. Let's go under the schema showed up called data. Here's the tables that we were talking about. No, really, their tables are there. Oh, come on. Sometimes things just get a little bit out of whack, right? Gotta love SaaS-based tools for that. There we go. All of our tables have showed up, but they're empty because all my database project has is the, you know, kind of metadata around what I want my database to look like. So those could be tables, stored procedures, functions, whatever. So Benjamin, this kind of covers a little bit of what you were asking about, right? How would you get this into source control? And this is exactly how I do it with all of my projects. I run these database projects. Everything is version controlled. You can see I have that on an actual branch because on the first branch, I keep what the Contoso database looks like over on Azure SQL. how it originally came to me, and now this branch is what I've done all my changes to. So yeah, come on off mute and add
Yeah.
to it.
So whenever I'm working with a data analyst that may not have as much data engineering background and it's just interesting to me that the process that you have shown there, yeah, that works, or like the application, what is it, Azure Data Studio or VS Code and all the extensions, but you still don't have that functionality within Fabric on the web, or at least that I don't see that same functionality through just the web interface. And I just kind of wanted to ask if you thought there was any, yeah, if you had any thoughts against that, because it seems like
So yeah, so the most I could say is the P in Fabric is for patience. I expect them to come out with something more about that, right? Because you could actually connect a Git repository, like a GitHub branch folder to, and I don't know that I have it set up on this tenant, but you could connect Git to it. And like you said, kind of, as long as you've done that at your workspace level, then natively the notebooks are going to check in, which is kind of what you were implying earlier, right? I hope and expect that they would get there for the same thing for the metadata for the data warehouse. But that's just I haven't heard anything one way or another. But I would suspect that if they're going to do it, it was going to be based upon those database projects, because they put out a database project for Fabric. They put support for it out a lot sooner than they ever did for like Azure Synapse Analytics or whatever. So again, I would say patience, and I think it's going to come. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess this is reflecting my own personal yeah, like friction points within the Azure data engineering and data science, and to an extent even the analysis and reporting workspace, that like the version control has never been perfect. There's always been approaches via VS Code or via Studio Code, and that's great, but it always still felt lacking in a way that other platforms kind of demonstrate some strengths.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you know that you could connect your workspace to an Azure DevOps. Yeah, you're looking for a first-class integration. I think we all are, right? So I think we all share in that frustration, but they're making steps for that. So connecting a workspace to an Azure DevOps Git repository, right, is a preview feature that's out there now. You could use it. I use it quite a bit. But yeah, it's not a first class integration with the warehouses yet, and I'm hoping just like you that it comes. Again, that's all in preview. The standard line from Microsoft at that point is ideas.fabric.com, right, or ideas.microsoftfabric.com, whatever that right link is. Find it, vote it up. Um, it is a common discussion, and the more people we have having this discussion about we want more, Git repository integration, CI/CD, let's grow up. Then yeah, it's definitely got to get there. And I see your question about, can I talk about Microsoft Purview in Fabric? I have seen very little with it. It's not something that I've focused on a whole lot. Purview to me is one of these things that are getting very mixed messages, because just the admin reporting they're calling Purview, and then there's a whole Purview server that's still service that lives in Azure. I think the story is still going to be written there, so there's not a whole lot more I could talk about it from that, because yeah, some of the data lineage and everything, it was never great in Azure Purview, and I haven't seen it get to be that great yet in Fabric. But hopefully they have a team working on it. I don't know whether they do or not. So yeah, Purview was extremely expensive, right? I think I dedicated one night to where I spun it up, looked at it, and spun it down because somebody else that I know spent $300 in a day or two with the amount that it billed them. So you got to be very careful with Azure, the true Azure purview. So I haven't found a big need for it. I had a client that tried twice to implement it, and they just didn't have the longevity to keep doing it. So, all right, so let's kind of I think we're coming up on about the hour here. I know you scheduled this all the way till 9 or 9 my time, so I don't know if you want me to go that long, but we'll move just a little bit.
Go as far as you'd like.
Okay.
This is a user group. This isn't like a paid conference.
It's fine. You know me, I'll just keep talking. So but
Get
let's
that man a
yeah,
glass of wine.
let's get through one other thing, because I wanted, we kind of covered, hey, here's a way to manage your objects, get them out there. We saw how easy that is. You could watch me on Fabric Fridays. I'm going to continue on this talk on there. We had it again last week, and I'll do some more on it. Kevin Chant is another good person to follow if you're really interested, Benjamin, on that. Look him up on the social medias. He's got a lot of good articles on CI/CD around databases. So, okay, so let's kind of jump to, we have our structure out there, but what about getting our data? And if we go back to our new, right, we have all these options. Actually, I'm going to go back to switch to the persona here. The two main areas that you're going to look at for a data warehouse are data pipelines and data flow Gen 2. And I think you're really going to end up making a decision on which one to use. I think data pipelines are faster. I've had a little bit more success with them, but data flow Gen 2 has more connectors, kind of like what regular data flows have, and will support the on-prem gateway. So if you have on-prem data, you're pretty much going to be coming through a data flow at this point. But if you can get to a data pipeline is very closely related to an Azure Data Factory project. In fact, you'll see a lot of similarities there. So let's go ahead and create a data pipeline real quick. And I was actually surprised how quickly this ran earlier today. I'm going to stick with just a default name, pipeline 1. And when it comes up, it has these kind of ways to help you pre-build, or you could build your own custom with all these activities on top. You can move and see even more activities. You could put if conditions in, for loops and everything. But I'm going to use this copy data function because I already have a SQL database. Remember, it's a 10 million row database. I want to connect to it and just bring in all that data. So I'm going to come down here to my set of connectors. What does it have under file? Oh, FTP. Yeah, notice it doesn't have under file like OneNote, or I'm not sorry, OneNote, but getting the SharePoint or anything like that. So you still have to use like data flows for that. Okay, so I'm going to pick SQL Server, and Benjamin, I will get you that link here in just a minute. So SQL Server, I already have an existing connection out there to my Contoso database. I hope it's still active. Let me test it. Okay. It's supposed to go down after an hour, so I can't remember how long I've just used it for. All right, and then I'm going to choose next. And it's going to say, do you want to bring in tables, or do you want to write your own query? I'm going to go ahead and select the tables that I want to bring in. And remember, all of my tables live in the data schema. So I'm just going to select each one of these, the way this database is set up. And then I'm going to click next, and I'm going to tell it that my output, my destination, some places call it destination, some call it source and sink. Everybody's got different words for everything. So I'm going to say to my warehouse, existing warehouse. So I'm going to be able to select it and go to SD demo that I just created. Next. And I'm going to tell it to load into existing tables. And it's going to allow me to come out in here and remap things if I want it to. The default mapping, because I already changed all my data types, right? Now it's saying it's going to end varchar, but that's not totally true because I already have the tables out there. So, and I had to create them with a varchar. I just noticed that. I didn't look at it earlier. Anyways, so you see it went ahead and mapped all of those. I'm going to set next. And when you're working with a data warehouse through this process, you have to enable staging. So if you turn that off, you're going to get a message saying you need to turn it back on. So I'm going to save it and run. And I was shocked because I ran this earlier and I expected it to take, 30 minutes for my 10 million rows. It finished in 2 minutes. So during this 2 minutes, let me jump back over to another browser window and get to my GitHub. And the repository is this one. And let's check on our output here. So you can see it's that everything has kind of gotten started. It's been going for this 39 seconds to get that other link. And no, pipeline 1 was not added to my Git repo because I don't have the Fabric Git integration only works with Azure DevOps. And this Git repo that I have as the Fabric database project is over on GitHub. So GitHub is not supported yet as a method for storing artifacts. That's another one we hope will be coming, but they started with an Azure, the ADO. Now I just lost it. Azure DevOps. Okay, so you can see that this is continuing to run. We have a couple that have already finished. These 2 that are left over will take just another minute. Those are my 2 big ones. One's going to be my customers. The other one's going to be my orders. Come on, don't make a big liar out of me. Don't make me fill time. I'll do a song and dance. Because what we're going to see is in the output, when this finishes, and actually, you know what? I could go over here. So, okay, it's almost 3 minutes. I don't need you guys to wait that long for it. But almost 3 minutes. And you could see here that it wrote 10 million rows, right? So if we go here to here, over 10 million rows that it copied over from a SQL database into Fabric within 3 minutes.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was surprised that it went that fast. And now if we go back to our database that started off empty, let me do a refresh from this level because we should have data into, so you can see we have data into this currency exchange. I bet you we already have, I think it's doing commits along the way, right? So we have customer data, we have order rows. Okay, so that's all great, but how do we get it out into Power BI? Well, whenever you set up a warehouse or a lakehouse, you have this default data set. And what I do want to point out here, and I know this is a little big, let me knock this part down, is because I created these foreign keys inside my database metadata, this semantic model already picked it up and set the relationships for the tables. So if you're putting tables out for your N star schema and set the relationships, this default model is going to pick it up. I tend not to use the default semantic model a whole lot. I use it for kind of browsing what's out there and everything. So what I kind of tend to come out to is say, I want to do a new semantic model. And I'm going to just call it 1. And what I could do is say, I only want the objects that are in DBO. In fact, I only want the views that are in DBO, because that's how this database was set up. And that's all the metadata that I brought over. So I'm going to say confirm. It's going to take just a second here. Should be a little bit less than a second, but you know, everything's got to be slower when the demo gods are laughing at you. I'm going to go ahead and hit that. So it's going to open it up in a new tab. And now you can see I have all of my objects that live within this workspace. So let me make this, I know you won't be able to see the objects a whole lot, the names, but let's just try to get this to be somewhat of what I'm hoping will become a star schema. So I got sales, right? What our normal Contoso looks like. Now notice we didn't see that, right? Because the way that they set up this database is the views do our data transformation from what our native application looks like. So if you want to learn some type of transformation, you know, by using views, you could go ahead and look at that GitHub repository and look at what has come out from the Contoso database. And then, of course, I could set up, because these are views, those relationships were not set with my views, but I could do my setting of my keys. And it used to be the way that I dragged it was important. So it's going to say from sales to this, many to 1. And I believe that's going to be right. Yes. So you could come up here and do all of your changes, the majority of your changes to your semantic model up on the web using the web modeling view. On this default one, we could do changes here, but if I make changes to the underlying objects, it could end up resyncing it and changing it. That's one of the reasons that I tend not to do a whole lot on this. If you also notice, when I'm looking at things like table tools or whatever on the default data set, and it's always important to clarify whether you're looking at a default data set or one that was produced, right? Here, I could produce a calculation group. On the other one, I couldn't. I could edit the tables. Let's see what, oh, I can edit tables is just allowing me to take ones away. I could deselect them. So, you know, the whole web modeling view, it's not 100% there yet, but it's getting a whole lot better. And then from here, I just got a regular semantic model that I could produce Power BI reports to. Once I put all my relationships in, put my measures in, if I have a calculation group, I could now open this one with Tabular Editor and stuff like that. So
Siri has a question.
Can we export the semantic model once created in? So I'm going to ask you to kind of help define export a little bit.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I have, for archiving purposes, and with the regular data flow or regular data sets, you have option to do that as JSON file or .pbix. So I'm curious if this can be export to your local.
If I had that type of compliance requirement, I wouldn't want to do it onto my local, right? I'm assuming it's some type of compliance and that you want to keep it. What I would end up doing is build that logic into my warehouse or my my Lakehouse. And actually within the warehouse, there's an option called clone table, right? And I would clone all the data. I would keep it within my Fabric setup rather than what is in the semantic model.
Gotcha.
Right. But I think the other part of it that you're kind of asking is where I first took your question is, could I download it? I'm not 100% sure. So let's kind of open this file. Yeah, I don't think you could download this one once you created it up on the service. I do know you could use the XMLA endpoint and get it. You could use a tool like Tabular Editor to open it up and then bring down Tabular Editor would bring down all the metadata, but that's not bringing down data like you were asking yet. So if I was doing it from this solution, I would look at having my compliance data stored up in other areas within my Lakehouse, right? Version control and things like that. Not version control of the metadata, but the actual data.
Got it. Thank you.
You know, I mean, you could always run other reports and say export. You could run it like, you know, a paginated report and get everything out and send that somewhere or whatever. So that type of thing. But thanks, good question. That, everybody, is the end of my demo. I'm not going to go into producing a report. That's just all things that would be kind of normal from here. So is there any other questions that people have?
Kevin, really appreciate you staying longer than expected here. I know it's kind of late for you. 8:30.
Oh, no worries. No worries at all. I knew that coming in, so. Here we go. We'll create a blank report, even though there's not, all the relationships aren't there, so it isn't really going to work too well. But I could grab something from customer and it would actually show. Uh-oh. Wah, wah.
Note to
Something
self.
is wrong there. It didn't link it the way it was supposed to.
Note to self, don't demo reports.
Yeah, I mean, because really notice there's not really a refresh. Well, there is refresh here. Refresh is just going back through and getting us. Notice it was extremely fast. I wonder if that's going to work now.
LaDon, you have a
If we
question?
did that.
Sure, Tim. Thank you. So my question for you, Kevin, is is Fabric to the point where it's substantially better than using maybe individual components like a data factory or Synapse, or just is it to that point where it's just so cohesive that you don't have to really use those other things?
That's an excellent question. Am I allowed to answer this one with it depends? But actually, my first answer would be yes. But I'm not going to say you're not going to run into something that you might have to go out to a data factory to kind of do or whatever. So, as I said, I sold a client out on Fabric prior to Fabric being GA'd, and timed it so that the timing happened to work out. I got to the end of the project and Fabric got to be GA, and we were pretty lucky. I have sources coming from Excel spreadsheets from them that they wanted to type in. We have at least 3, maybe 4 SaaS-based tools that we connect to, which include accounting tools, time entry tools, things like that, that all have APIs to them. I wrote all of that in notebooks and bring it all in. And it's been up and running since since Fabric's been GA'd, without issues that I haven't introduced with code changes. So I think it's a very successful project. Yeah, it's kind of small, but it's, it works. And they're small, right? So they're using an F2. And I actually at first set it up because their data was so small. I set up the data warehouse, went into the SQL endpoint of the data warehouse and did an import of the data set onto a pro capacity. So I was able to actually shut down their capacity. And this way, I think it was going to cost them like $50 a month. Now they've decided they want to run it anytime they want during the day. So we're keeping it up. That's $200, $250 a month. So Yeah, so it could be, so yeah, but again, evaluate based upon everything that you have. But I'm starting to see others come out with bigger projects on Fabric, so I think it is there. The stuff that Benjamin is talking about, including source control, CI/CD, governance. Tim kind of brought this up yesterday as well. We were talking about governance on how do you want to set up your workspace or workspaces? Do you want to put everything into one place? And I saw an interesting discussion on a Slack channel about this the other day, to where one guy, his first name is Just, Just. B, I think, is his last initial. He's another MVP. He was saying he's going to come out with blogs about this, but he sets up a workspace that has the code objects, and then another workspace that has the data, and then his developers use the Git repos connected to the code objects, and then produce their own little ones from there, but then connect over to say that where the data is, so they don't have to keep repeating that. The governance has got a little ways to go still. So if you're working on a big team, you need to have very, very, very strong governance processes. That falls into it depends. It may not be there for you yet. If you could work smaller projects, then you could work with the governance that happens to be there now, so you can start getting your feet wet, then I would say go for it. So, yeah.
Well, Mr.
Sure,
Kevin,
Benjamin.
I think that I know I'm starving. You must be exhausted. A lot of good material, a lot of great questions today.
A lot of great. Benjamin, everybody, thank you for the discussion. I love it when people, come out with questions. I think it makes a much better presentation. So thank you all for having me. And I look forward when you have that budget to bring me out to speak in person.
Yeah, most definitely. All right, let me just stop the recording.